Hi, folks. I see people are joining now. I'm just going to give it another minute as we let more people into the webinar, and then we'll get started. Well, a minute was hyperbolic. Let's go. Hi, welcome to this Americans for Peace Now webinar. I'm Madeleine Cereghino, APN's Director of Government Relations, and I will be introducing our guests in a moment. But before we get started, I'll give our usual housekeeping notes. First off, you'll see that this is being recorded. It will be available on our YouTube in a little bit. And we will be taking questions toward the end of the webinar. If you have a question during, just feel free to type it into the question box and we will get to it as we can. But try to keep your question as succinct as possible. And yeah, that's about it. So this webinar will be talking about President Biden's new executive order and settler violence. As we saw in 2023, there was a significant surge in settler violence in the West Bank. And now President Biden has taken the unprecedented step to curb this violence by earlier this month issuing an executive order targeting Israeli settlers accused of perpetrating attacks against Palestinians and Israeli peace activists. The order, while initially focusing on 4 individuals, has broader reaching implications for the settlement enterprise. Today, we are privileged to have 2 distinguished experts with us, Joel Braunold, the Managing Director at Daniel Abraham Center for Middle East Peace, and Lior Amihai, the Executive Director of Peace Now, or as it's called in Hebrew, Shalom Hashav. They will be providing us with insights into President Biden's executive order, its potential impact on mitigating extremist settlers, and the broader implications on the settlement enterprise. So let's get into it. Before we begin talking about the executive order itself, however, I'm going to ask Lior if you could give us an understanding of the situation in the West Bank. There's been a notable surge in settler violence, particularly under this current coalition. So could you shed light on the factors contributing to this rise? Are there specific policy changes or political dynamics within the coalition that have influenced this trend? And additionally, following the terrorist attacks on October 7th, have you observed any shifts in the frequency or nature of the violent incidents, or perhaps a heightened willingness to ignore settler activities by the Israeli authorities? Sorry, that's a lot of questions in one.
Thank you, Madeleine, and thank you, APN, for hosting myself and for all the participants who are listening to us right now. So thank you for this opportunity and to talk about this very important issue. And you did ask a lot of questions, Madeleine. So maybe I'll say from Peace Now, I'll say a word. I'm sure most people know this, but we have, if we simplify things, 2 major operations. One of them is the Peace Now, the movement, where we try to represent Israelis who want to reach a 2-state solution and to end the occupation. And the other is our Settlement Watch team. And there we have 2 renowned experts who their day job is to research on the ground the developments that are happening in the settlement enterprise. And these 2 researchers are doing this so not necessarily these 2, but Peace Now has been doing this since the early 1990s and is giving us a lot of insights to what's actually happening on the ground and the nuances and the changes and the implications of these changes. Now, I think that we're just finishing off an extraordinary year in terms of the settlement enterprise. And you can really divide it into 2 parts. The first part is from the formation of this current government and until October 7th. And of course, highlighted by the judicial coup, the attempt to change the judicial system in the state of Israel. And then, of course, since October 7th, the Hamas terror attack and the war that followed since. And I think from a very interesting perspective in our eyes, is that settlement activity and right-wing politics in this regard had significant, if not the most significant, influence and impact to both of these things, or elements or characteristics of these 2 periods. And what we've seen that since the formation of this government and until October 6th, and then since October 7th to the day, is just an extraordinary year in terms of settlement activities and development on the ground. It's I don't know how much details you want me to go into this, but if we're talking about settler violence, I think I'll just say two things about them. I'll say one is direct settler violence, which received, our criticism towards settler violence was that it is, or one of the criticisms, our major criticism is that the Israeli government and the law enforcement mechanisms of the state of Israel, that is chiefly the military and the police, that one, that they don't do enough to prevent it, and two, is that they actually support it in their actions. And what we're seeing through this government is just that this is, we've seen the head of the Ministry of the Police, Itamar Ben-Gvir, it was leaked that he ordered them the police not to deal with settler violence. This is not important, for example, or to get over to the hilltops and to build settlements, or to, the Minister of Finance to say to burn down or to destroy a Palestinian village, for example. This is all ministers in this government, and this is the spirit that is coming top down. Now, on the ground, we saw this, we saw it. We saw a lot of settler violence, a lot of settler groups that go down to Palestinian villages, that throw stones at them, throw cocktail. But we've seen pogroms during this past year, something that even if we saw them in the past, we didn't see it in this extent and in this intensity since. And it's just unbelievable how much we've witnessed through this year. And if we would have spoken a year and 2 months ago, I would have still told you that settler violence is horrible and significant and is shameful for me as an Israeli, that we have portions of our country that conduct it, and that our government and law enforcement still don't prevent it. So this is certainly has been an intensified year in settler violence, in both the intensity and the quantity and quality. And the second thing is, of course, the outcomes or the purpose of settler violence. And I think there's a really important message here. And that is that settler violence, and this is what we say, and if you've heard talks about settler violence, or if you've read about it, this is something that's very important. Settler violence is a means to an end. It's a political mean for a political end. And often we used to say that it has two aims. One, it is to terrorize Palestinian communities, that they will be afraid, that they will stay within their homes, that they won't leave, that they won't go to the olive harvest, that they'll stay at their homes, etc. And two, and I'll just say here, we must be reminded that these are Palestinians under occupation that don't have police to protect them, or law enforcement of their own to protect them. So they're completely dependent on Israeli mechanisms, which are failing them dramatically. And the second purpose is to take control over land and territory. And we see this by pushing Palestinian communities away and establishing outposts and settlements later on and taking control of the territory. Now, in both these regards, we've seen this intensify. Again, the pogroms that we've seen, and I'll say even more than that. And of course in the outposts that were established. And I'll say two examples, and then I'll say another purpose that was revealed this year. We've seen throughout this year that the settlers in 2023, they built 26 new outposts. Now, 26 new outposts means 26 new settlements. It's the same, meaning eventually. An outpost is a settlement that doesn't have the official Israeli approval. And we've seen the processes of outposts that they start with a small outpost and they expand and they grow, etc. And so this year alone, settlers initiated 26 new settlements on the ground. And the mirror image is that they also, because of settler violence and because of lack of protection by the Israeli military and police, we saw 21 Palestinian communities that were forcibly displaced. 5 of them before October 6th and under this government, and 16 of them immediately following October 7th. And these are two mirror images. One is to take over territory and to establish settlements and control, and the other is to throw the Palestinians away, take them to take over their lands and prevent them from reaching their lands and to transfer them, basically. Now, this is what's happened in 2023 alone. But another thing that I want to say, this is something that I wouldn't have said, and and again, these are, before I was with Peace Now, and Peace Now deals with settler violence very intensively, but I was also the director of Yesh Din, which is directly involved. This is what Yesh Din does. And so I know this from very close, the work on settler violence. So if it would have met in late 2022, I would have told you all what I said. I would have told you, only not in this dramatic fashion. It was still very, very dramatic, and still a lot of things have happened, but not as much as we've witnessed this year. But what I wouldn't have told you at all is the third purpose of settler violence, and this is something that we've seen, or that we are analyzing, or we believe is happening since October 7th, and that is the wish or the intention that settler violence will lead to to initiate a third fighting front. We have the war in Gaza. We are seeing fighting in the north with Hezbollah and in the South Lebanon, and of course the Houthis and from the sea and everything. But we are seeing, we're analyzing that settlers who are participating in settler violence, there's another intention, and that is to create chaos and war, again, in order to have a moment for them to meet their messianic ambitions of taking over the entire territory. And this is what they want. They do not want to calm down, and they do not want things to reach a peaceful or a stable situation, rather the exact opposite. And we're seeing it from the ministers that represent these settler violence, and to, of course, on the ground. And I'll end here, and I'll just say that I think that the American sanctions that were imposed for the first time in relation to Israel symbolizes three things, or it's because of three things. One, it's shameful but true and unbelievable, hard for me to say, but the American government administration is telling Israel that it doesn't believe its law enforcement. They're sanctioning settlers not because they have a lot of files in the police or they were acquitted or anything. It's because they're taking things to their own hand. They're having their own list, and they're deciding, no, we don't trust the Israeli law enforcement mechanism. So we will have our own list, and we will decide who enters the U.S. and who will sanction them, because we don't want anyone to be affiliated with them. This is dramatic. The second thing is that I think that they lack trust that the Israeli government wants to have a two-state solution, wants to end the conflict, wants to have peace. If we would have had another government, even under the circumstance of a two-state solution, but a government that they could work with, that they could trust, I don't think the U.S. would have went this far. But thirdly, and I think this is the most important thing for the Americans, and this is something that we felt long before October 7th, is that the most important interest of the U.S. is that there will be de-escalation. The violence won't erupt. That the region will be stable. And I think that they realize, rightfully so, that settler violence could certainly threaten an opening of a third front. And the U.S. administration is now taking action in order to prevent it, because they don't see that the Israeli government and the Israeli military and the Israeli police are doing anything to prevent it. So they're seeing the danger, the risk that a third front could erupt due to settler violence, and they're taking steps in order to prevent this. So I think I'll end here. I think I've said enough already.
Thank you so much. I think that gives us a really great picture of the situation that we're working with. Joel, I'd love to turn to you. We've obviously mentioned the executive order, but we haven't actually talked about it. Do you think you could run through the basics of it, what it does, how it works, etc.?
Yeah, sure. And thanks, APM, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you and with Lior, and of course with Ori, who's been a staple of our small community in Washington for a very long time. When I first saw the text of the executive order, I was actually floored, like blown away. The Biden administration, for the first time in history, the US has created a unique sanctions regime just in the West Bank. And it's actually not just in the West Bank. Matt Duss apparently found out that it also includes East Jerusalem. It's not in the text of the order, but he checked. And so West Bank and East Jerusalem, I should say. So the executive order basically uses the same authorities that the president has when he does sanctions on Russian oligarchs, on Iran, on lots of other different things. He uses the powers given to him by IEPA, which is the Emergency Economic Powers Act that enables him to declare a national emergency and then declare sanctions against people who are exacerbating that emergency. The sanctions are full flex sanctions, so it's not just travel restrictions to enter into the United States, but basically says that the foreign individuals named by such sanctions are functionally cut off from all US financial systems. We'll get into what that actually means in a second, and prevents US citizens or US persons, which includes green cards, from supporting, donating, doing anything that would materially support those sanctioned individuals. So it's the same sanctions that you'd have if you were a Russian oligarch or you were breaking human rights works. It's identical. The executive order is not targeted actually just at settlers and settler violence. The administration on that Q&A said it's anyone in the West Bank, and it can include Palestinians. I think it's important to note that the West Bank is full of sanctioned individuals at this point, mainly Palestinians, if not exclusively Palestinians, before this executive order, who are under sanctions because of foreign terrorist organization connections. And so if you've ever done work in the West Bank, whether you're a human rights organization, a peace-building organization, you are very aware of the difficulty of working within an environment with many different US sanctioned individuals and entities. But the executive order is targeted, as the administration said, at settler violence. But, and I think this is really key, if you read the text of the executive order, the first thing that it says when it goes down in terms of what this is targeting, it's anyone who is to be responsible or complicit in, or who has directly or indirectly engaged in or attempted to engage in the following, okay? The first thing is actions. So what are these actions? Anything including directing, enacting, or implementing, enforcing, or failing to enforce policies that threaten the peace, stability, or security of the West Bank. That is tremendously broad. Okay, that is not if you're committing acts of violence. That is if the administration takes it that you are someone who is either failing to enforce directly or indirectly doing anything that threatens the peace, stability, and security of the West Bank. It's so broad that, you know, some people on the left have poo-pooed the executive order as ridiculous, it doesn't do anything. I'd ask you to look at the people on the political right who are very much not believing that. Ambassador David Fruman commented that this is basically an ability for the president to sanction anyone who disagrees with his policies. Eugene Kontorovich from the Kohelet Forum wrote that this is a gigantic issue, as did Rich Goldberg from FDD. And so those politically connected on the right recognize that this is a completely new set of tools that the administration has created for itself. It continues that, you know, if you are threatening or participating acts of violence targeting civilians, if you place civilians in a reasonable fear of violence, such as property destruction, seizure or dispossession of the property by private actors, or if you are a leader in any entity, including a government entity, that participates in basically property destruction or seizure or violence or threaten the peace and stability and security of the West Bank, this can target you. So when it came out, I wrote on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling it nowadays, that basically the Biden administration has created a weapon of mass destruction against the entire settlement enterprise, if they so choose to use it in that manner. But they're using it as a scalpel. And the administration at the beginning on February 1st, when it announced this, named 4 individuals who they decided to target with this initial round of sanctions. And I think it's interesting to see what happened when they announced it. For something that was so momentous, on the first, you know, wave of responses, the Israelis kind of shrugged their shoulders. I mean, the Prime Minister's office put out a statement that said, you know, this seems inappropriate. But that was pretty much it. And the targeted individuals were like, I don't do work in the US, so why do I care? You know, within 2 days, all their bank accounts were frozen and they couldn't work out why. And then the finance minister, Mr. Smotrich, ordered the banks to restore their services and then found that he couldn't. There were crowdfunding campaigns made for these sanctioned individuals that were suddenly shut down. And all of these things are because I don't think anyone in Israel, and definitely not the philanthropic scene that I'm sure we'll get to later, has experienced what it's like to actually deal with a US sanctions regime. And And Israeli banks, especially if they have branches in the US or if they're, participating in the SWIFT system, are obligated to comply or be under significant risk of penalties and potentially criminal liability themselves. So it's a very serious action the administration's taken. And reflecting off Lior's first answer, the reason that the Biden administration has reached this point is that since it was sworn into office, the Biden administration has raised the issue of settler violence again and again and again. And they have felt that the issue has not and was not being taken seriously enough, especially by this Israeli coalition. They have been extremely frustrated by the fact that this has been raised and that they see, as Yesh Din has put out, very, very low percentages of cases followed up. Before October 7th, we had the whole backwards and forwards of what was going on in Hawara and everything else. And the administration has watched with dismay. And despite many calls to the Israeli government to deal with this phenomena, they felt it hadn't. And so they felt, we're going to take this issue into our own hands. And by creating a sanctions regime, the administration has broken a seal. And that seal means that, and I said this on a previous event I was just at, from the moment the Biden administration did this, they have now created a new reality in Israel. And until the conflict with the Palestinians is ended, Israel will never again be a country whose individuals are not under sanctions, Western sanctions. Because even should a different administration, a Trump administration, come in and take away the executive order, the UK and France have already issued their own sanctions. And given that new reality, this has created a new situation for violent settlers, that they will now be subject to Western sanctions and financial sanctions, and that's a completely new ballgame.
Thank you. Lior, if you want to add anything, feel free to jump in. All right, then I'll move on to our next question. I want to talk a little bit about how significant this executive order is compared to previous steps that were made. Like you said, I believe you called it a nuclear. What did you call it exactly?
It's a weapon of mass destruction or a nuclear
weapon of mass destruction. Sorry, WMD. So yeah, I was wondering if you could talk about how significant this step is. I know at the end of last year, the Biden administration announced a travel ban, but this is obviously taking it much further.
It's many magnitudes further. I think that when we look at advocates who have been calling on US administrations to use leverage, to use sticks, all other different manners, often a lot of the approach should be on Congress, trying to move congressional legislation, restrictions, whatever it might be. The administration, through this action, basically utilized existing authority, which is vast. The president's emergency powers are gigantic, and utilized it in this context. And by doing so, he created a sanctions regime out of thin air, and basically empowered Treasury and state to suggest people they could add on to it. If you're just banning a visa, if you don't want to come to the United States, okay, you can continue. It doesn't seem to affect the individual. By having a full sanctions, and now the Israelis are recognizing what that actually means in terms of the loss of an ability to participate in basically modern banking services. If the administration enforces the sanctions against these four to the fullest extent, the political ripples and repercussions in Israel are gigantic. Already, we've heard Israelis, Tzvi Sukkot, who is a member of Ben Gvir's party, who heads up the subcommittee on security in the West Bank, and others have said, how could it be someone who's not even under investigation or has been cleared by the government of Israel could be sanctioned in this way? These people are, they are, what does they say? They say, they're fruit of the earth, they're, hardworking individuals. Well, this is what America as a superpower looks like, and they can utilize and bully their way to try and get their manner. And as Lior said, and I think it's important, this leverage is being used about a specific issue. The administration is furious about what they feel is a lack of care of trying to prevent the West Bank from imploding, and this desire to try and create it. And so they've taken this issue into their own hands. And it was reported yesterday, I think in the Times of Israel the day before, that they're going to announce another round of sanctioned individuals. And we've seen before, Scott Anderson mentioned this, who's at Brookings. Other sanctions regimes have started very small and then have grown. And this new leverage tool that the Biden administration has created the political reverberations in Israel about what this can mean are significant and can continue to be significant. And if the Israeli government officials, such as Minister Ben-Gvir and Mr. Smotrich, respond by doing things that upset the Americans, we could see an escalation or an escalatory cycle move quite quickly.
Thank you. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about what the way this could be expanded. Um, First off, you mentioned Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. Do you foresee the possibility of it being extended to include, politicians and other Israeli government officials who, incite or support settler violence? And what considerations might influence the decision to add more individuals to the sanctions list?
I'll go first, and then Lior, you feel free. It was reported at the time in Axios. Barak Ravid claimed that Ben-Gvir was on the list and was taken off just before. To sanction a sitting security cabinet member of the government of Israel would be a gigantic escalation. Let's just be very clear. That's not something that I think you do casually. I think that the Americans are trying to demonstrate, and they say this in the executive order and other things when you look at this, sanctions aren't meant as a punishment. They're meant as to correct someone's behavior. Okay, so if they see the Israelis taking actions to curb settler violence, I would assume that they would use this tool less. If they don't, then I assume that they would use this tool more. The executive order, as I commented just before, is extraordinarily broad in terms of who it can target. It could target units in Kogat. It could target settler regional councils. It could target institutions that dispossess Palestinians and give it to private sector individuals. By the way, it could also target Palestinians if they felt that Palestinians were participating in a similar approach, and they could list additional Palestinians onto such a sanctions list. And that would be the case, especially if they couldn't identify a Palestinian as a member of a terrorist organization. This would give them the authority to prevent Palestinians participating in similar things that would threaten the peace, stability, and security of the West Bank. So the expansion opportunities are limitless. The limitation on them is, what does the administration want to achieve and how does it attempt to achieve it? You could sanction everyone, but suddenly the enforcement of that is gigantic. And like any tool, it is what you put into it. If you start with small and you enforce those small ones fully, it has it should have a deterrence effect. If you put 1,000 people on it and you don't enforce it very well, then it doesn't really have a deterrence effect. So it's something that, again, it's a new tool. It means that OFAC lawyers and people who follow this at state, you've got to build a whole infrastructure around this to monitor and make sure that what's happened is being enforced in order to give it credibility. So I don't expect personally a massive expansion, significantly hundreds of names coming on this very soon, but I do expect this to ratchet up, that if there's credible evidence that is delivered, often it seems through the USSO, the USSC, the United States Security Coordinator, who's a 3-star general, and it comes up to state and it's checked and it's verified and it's credible, that more individuals be added until the deterrence effect is created, that people take this seriously. And the political outcry in Israel, and Lior, I'll pass this off to you to get your thoughts on this, will only increase. With 4 people, it's one thing. If you've got 100 people, if you've got, a head of a settler regional council who's an important figure in a Likud primary, it's going to change the entire dynamics of this. And I'll finish by saying, I commented earlier in the last question that the Israeli response when the sanctions were initially announced was limited. Well, since then, it's been reported that the Prime Minister has raised this with the Secretary of State and with the President, and has asked, his key person in the US relationship, Ron Dermer, to ask for urgent clarifications about what this could and couldn't mean. I think the Israelis are becoming aware very quickly about what this is, and now panicked is probably too strong a word, but are extremely concerned about what this could look like and the dynamics and the tremors it could create in this current Israeli coalition. But Lior, I'll pass over to you for anything more on that.
Look, I think you summed it up very well. I'll just say 2 points on this, and I think you did mention this, but maybe I'll just flash them. There's one, it's that it's not only U.S., and we know that there's a lot of discussions in Europe on this. and so not only some European countries have followed suit to some degree, this might escalate. We might be able to see more European countries following this. So this is it left the how do you say it, like the machine is rolling now. So we'll see where it goes. And the second is that I think what's key here is that eventually there's a lot of how the Americans will feel towards the Israeli government will mean a lot about how this will follow. And even these four now that they've set it to sanction, we published in our settlement watch team published that one of the settlers that was sanctioned had a contract with a trust of one of the settler regional councils. And even after he was sanctioned, the same trusts also issued, raised funds for him, which was suddenly stopped. If, for example, the Americans decide, and the sanctions or the executive order does say that anyone who engages with these sanctions would also be sanctioned or will also be in trouble. So if the Americans, for example, decide to implement what they said in that sense, only to the regional council's trust, although theoretically they can also go to the entire regional council, which is, it's as Joel said, it's very, very broad. If they go, so we'll see. But theoretically, this could be very dramatic and very big. And I think that now is what we're learning where this will develop. And I think the Israeli response to it will be very important on all levels, on settler violence, but also on maybe on other political levels as well. And so I think it's more to come. But I will just say this, that since the sanctions were put out, we did see settler violence at play. So there are at least some groups that this is not deterring them. And so we'll see how the Israeli government and law enforcement mechanisms respond to this, because I doubt that this will be enough to prevent the phenomena. So we'll have to see the Americans show that they're serious and that this is sincere, and European will follow. And we'll see how Israel responds, which is so far, until to date, I think we can say very confidently that the Israeli law enforcement mechanisms of the government of Israel failed on all fronts, at all periods of time, to deal adequately with settler violence. Let's speak in a couple of weeks or months to see if things have changed.
So you touched on this, Lior, with the settler with the trust in Hebron, but I want to get into that a little bit more, and how this executive order could really impact overseas fundraising for settlements. Do we see a potential, looking to both you, Lior, and Joel, for the financial aspect involved to kind of curb not just settler violence, but settler activities in general, if we start seeing US-based fundraising caught up in these sanctions?
Look, I'll say very briefly, because I think Joel, you'll have maybe even a much broader answer to this. But I'll say very briefly that from what I gather, from what I sense, it really depends on how the Americans implement this. Again, the Hebron Regional Council and the trust of the Hebron Regional Council certainly receives, I'm sure, receives funding also from U.S. donors, but it doesn't matter, because if they deal with one of the sanctions, one of the individuals who sanctions, so it doesn't matter where your money comes from, you will be suffered. So it's not just about American funds now; it's about anything. It can stop the entire the entire trust, really. So it really depends how far they will decide to go and how significant. And of course, if you take it to, it's not even a very broad level, but if we look at settler violence in the most simple terms, then it's just direct violence, right? But if you take an outpost, for example, which is preventing Palestinians from reaching their lands, or building on private land or lands of a nearby Palestinian village, right? That could also be interpreted as violence. And all of these outposts are funded directly or indirectly by Israeli money, by Israeli government money, Israeli regional or settlement councils money, etc. So again, I really think that it's too early to know, but at least what we're sensing is that it's definitely not the last word. I don't think that this will end here. I think that at least what we're sensing, the information that we're sort of hearing and gathering is that the Americans are serious, as they know to be serious, and they've definitely not said the last word. And I think that how Israel responds will affect how this will continue.
So I'll say a few words. The first is there was a big piece in the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, I think came out yesterday or the day before, about US philanthropy and are people worried? And most people were like, not really. But those who process donations on behalf of Israeli charities. So if an Israeli charity is not its own 501c3, often you'll have a pass-through. Someone's its fiscal agent, or you use PEF or something else. Those organizations have a legal responsibility to make sure that they are obeying US law. So I can tell you, as someone before I did this job, I was very involved in peace building. I had to have my own OFAC checks, and before I would send wires to peace builders or anything else, I had to check them against a list to make sure they weren't sanctioned individuals and know where the money was going. If I didn't do that and I by accident sent money to someone, I could be liable because I didn't have a system in place. Again, Jewish philanthropy in the West Bank. Again, if you're dealing in like Russia, like Chabad, for example, is extremely aware of sanctions law because they deal in places that are often under US sanctions. Okay. So like that's normal. But if you have never dealt with a US sanctions regime, I think a lot of our community in the Jewish community thinks this is just like another IRS issue. This is not another IRS issue. Okay. OFAC and the Department of Justice is no joke. It is extraordinarily serious. And so being able to identify who your money is benefiting if there are sanctioned individuals around. And as Lior said, it's 4 people at the moment. So you can say, okay, I'm not funding those 4 communities or whatever else, fine. But if it starts hitting additional larger entities, be it like the HaChevron, or if there are additional individuals or individuals who had entities, each one hits an entire spider web of things that turn red. Okay. And you need to know if you have exposure. Again, it doesn't mean that overnight a group's going to shut down, but it does mean that you need to have protocols to examine where your money is going. And you can't just, use donor advised funds and send them to, random groups in the West Bank if you don't know where it is. And I'll add, when the administration issued the executive order, it also issued a FinCEN notice, which is a notice that Treasury sent out to every banking institution that's connected to the US, telling them what to look for as red flags to see if people are trying to create a conspiracy to get around the order, which includes funding to, know who the board members are of different West Bank groups, if there's paramilitary gear being sent, all these things that the banking regulatory authorities should red flag. The administration is trying to up the level of risk for groups who are utilizing the banking system to support. And I'll say we've seen this exact same issue when it comes to supporting Palestinian rights work, where different banking institutions and payment processors basically say it's too risky to work in the West Bank because you could come afoul of sanctions. The more sanctioned individuals there are, the higher the level of risk for banks and payment processors to operate in that area. And so this isn't just a nature of, well, this sanctioned individual or another. The level of due diligence necessary and the risk that the third-party payment processors take increases with every sanctioned individual or entity. And so you're also going to see that there could be a threshold there. I think my main message on all of this, and to reflect Lior, this isn't a light action that President Biden took. If you could have told me that on October 8th that the president was going to issue a sanctions regime on the West Bank, I would have said you are smoking something. Like, there's no way. I think it is an exercise in their utter frustration and the desire to prevent an explosion in the West Bank that they've reached this level.
Thank you. We have a number of questions in the chat, so I'm going to try to weave them in together as we're nearing time here. I know we touched on the Israeli government's response, but I'd love to spend a little more time on it. Do we think these pressures will eventually influence policies regarding settlement expansion? And do we expect any change of course by the Israeli government? Also, there have been reports that Israel has been surveilling US data on settler attacks, not necessarily as part of Israel's effort to counter potential sanctions, indicating that the government is more interested in countering the sanctions than the settler violence itself. Maybe Lior, if you want to start with that.
Start with what? With what?
I mean, I think if we want to talk about more of the Israeli response, if this is true, you see the Netanyahu government really interested in countering these accusations, wanting to know what the U.S. knows rather than preventing the violence itself.
Look, I think a couple of things. One, I think that Joel described it very correctly in detail how the Israeli responded. And at first, it was we ignored it, it's not a big deal. Then they started to realize it, and I must say that I think that in Israel, a campaign began a couple of weeks or months ago already, saying that there is no such thing as settler violence. So I think something in Israel, in right-wing groups, in the government, in pro-settler or settler violence groups, is that there's understanding that something is happening and that they have to deal, they have to respond, that they haven't dealt with this, that they didn't realize how significant the issue of settler violence is being treated in the international community in the US. So they're trying to respond to it. Now, so they're working in their end. I don't know how Israel will respond eventually to this and how this will escalate or expand or nobody knows. I will say two things from knowing the Israeli government and the Israeli response in general and the DNA is one that Israel hasn't said its last word either. And I think that Israel will also use its political leverages in order to pressure Europe and the US in their ways to de-escalate this or to explain themselves or to argue this. It feels that Israel wasn't ready, a little bit surprised them to some degree, but they weren't prepared for this. And now these reports, for example, that they're trying to figure out how the US is getting this into their information and so on, I think is an indication of that. And the second is that, again, look, that the settler motivation, this settler force that the force is to take over Palestinian land and to go back. Now there's a campaign to establish settlements in the Gaza Strip right now, right? This is part of the settler ambitions. Israel, I think, there was no one period of time that we managed to prevent this force from playing out. During times of peace negotiations, during times of war, we're seeing it now, we've seen it in the past during intifadas, and during periods of stagnation. The settler powers are always at play. So this does not, right now, in this current being, this is not enough, of course, to prevent the settler movement from continuing. They will continue, they will find their ways and routes to continue. They still do, they're still doing to this day. After the sanctions, we still saw tenders being issued for settlements. We're seeing things, very dangerous developments in Jerusalem and Temple Mount, for example, that could certainly escalate violence. So Israel has not shifted its policies at all, one single bit, because of these sanctions. So I don't think this is a game changer yet in this sense. However, again, it's way too soon to see. We'll see how the Americans will continue to play, and we'll see how Israel deals with this. I think for me, it's too early to know exactly how this will play out.
I think I'll say a few things. The first is we already saw an article in the Tablet blaming General Fenzal, who's a USSC, for being hoodwinked by UN or pro-Palestinian data. I mean, the evidence is so overwhelming from the videos and the human rights community, and it's an absurd accusation, but we're already seeing that motivate and move forward. In Israel, it's already a legal issue. Like previous to the executive order, Roman Abramovich, who is a sanctioned Russian oligarch, wanted to give a large donation to Zaka, which is a humanitarian Jewish group who collects body parts after terror victims, and was prevented from doing so by the bank. And that's gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, because the bank says if we process this donation, we could be under US sanctions. And an appeals court said you should process it, and it's gone all the way to the Supreme Court. The crowdfunding campaign for the sanctioned individual, according to this EO, has already gone to court. They're claiming, look, it's for his kids. Why can't we have the money for the kids? And the court has said, look, while we debate this, you can't have the money. The money needs to go back to the donors because the risks are so high. So the judicial system in Israel is trying to process all of this work. But Israel is not Russia. It is not China. It is not Iran. its banking system and economy is so integrated and interlocked into the US financial system. They're especially vulnerable to this level of sanctions regime. So I do think we'll see, and depending on who the administration targets, if they start going after people who they clearly think is just for political reasons rather than those they can tie to violence, the reaction in the US will be greater rather than smaller. And as long as they are looking at dispossession and violence, I think that that will be a critical determinator in terms of how you would advocate against it. There's not really a lobby for settler violence in the US, right? There's a quite, some people on the left will say the whole sanctions regime is a misnomer because settler violence is state violence. And by doing this, you're claiming it as individual rather than the state. And so there are critiques from the left, even if they think that the sanctions regime is an important goal that should have been happened a while ago. But from the right, there isn't. There are people who are saying, this isn't our job. There's an Israeli judicial system or legal system, but people justifying violence against settlers is not. It's not like there's a giant lobby of people who want to do that. But I'm sure there is a lot of discomfort about folks being sanctioned by US sanctions who are an ally. And as I said, David Freeman's already promised that it wouldn't last the first day of a Trump administration, but the Israeli banks have to comply to UK and French sanctions as well. So the fact that it's already gone transnational outside of the bilateral relationship is important.
Thank you. Okay, we have a bunch of questions I want to get to. I know we're running out of time, so I apologize if I move a little quickly here. First off, we touched a little bit on the reporting, and Lior, I just want to give you a quick opportunity. I know Shalom Ashab has kind of created a reporting mechanism as well, and I'd love if you could speak briefly, I'm sorry, about that.
Yeah, sure, I'd love to. And I'll say, look, again, settler violence is something that is so significant, but until now, it was also ignored to a very large degree by official state of Israel and by the Israeli media and public. So it's not a complete ignore. You can't hear about it, you can't listen about it, but largely it was ignored. We haven't seen until last year, I would say, condemnations in any way. It took them a very long time to condemn the Khawar pogrom, to call it terror attack by Israel. So these things escalated this year, but for many years, Israel was silent on this. And even I think now on these sanctions, the mainstream media was not really gathering this, was not understanding this. This is very shallow analysis of, oh, this is the Biden administration trying to pressure the state of Israel style, or this is just they didn't know themselves how to deal with this. And of course, the Israeli government was saying that this is an exaggeration, or they didn't realize where this came from, or that they're wrong about this, and nobody really dealt with the issue of settler violence. And at peace now, we felt that the Israeli public needed to hear this, and we felt that the Israeli public needed to know that settler violence is so horrible that that the official response from anyone on this issue is to be ashamed, or to say, okay, we will do something to prevent it or stop it. Not to say that this is not happening, or to say it's ignored. The official's response was, this is not real, or it's not really happening, but to say, if this is happening, we'll do everything in our powers to prevent it and to stop it. And we tried to, so we issued a campaign in the Israeli public to say that anyone and also to Palestinians, we issue this in Arabic and in Hebrew, anyone who learns, knows, hears videos, knows settler violence, to report to us, and we'll report to anyone. Of course, we'll report first and foremost to the Israeli law enforcement mechanism, knowing that they won't do much, but also, as we do with all our work, to the public and to the world. And if the Americans want to collect it, we'll also report to the Americans and to the Europeans and whoever, because we feel, and this is from an Israeli point of view, that this is so shameful and so wrong and so dangerous, especially now, but always so dangerous, that we have to use, all our powers in order to be part of the mechanism that prevents and stops it. So this is why we issued this. I'll say we also cooperated with an activist organization that's on the ground regularly. So we have our researchers who study and know and help in their sort of ways, but they're also activists who are on the ground, who see this. And so we issued this together with, they're called Looking the Occupation in the Eye, and they have volunteers and activists on the ground, especially in the Jordan Valley and South Hebron Hills. So we do this together with them.
I just want to add two quick things. Firstly, there was a horrendous terrorist attack today in Malay Damim, and many Israelis will point out saying you're talking about settler violence and they're shooting up cars and killing pregnant people. And this is a disgraceful. How could you possibly be doing this? The US's frustration is in enforcement. They know that the IDF is going to go after those terrorists and then they'll demolish those terrorists' homes or wherever else. There isn't a worry that when Palestinians commit acts of violence that the IDF doesn't then go off and follow them. The war is the inverse. And if Israel actually was enforcing peace, stability, and security in the West Bank, there wouldn't be a need for this. I think that's important. I also perceive, should Lior and others continue to give information that leads to Israeli citizens being sanctioned, my expectation is they'll criminalize that in Israel in some way and claim that if you give information that leads to sanctions, that you can be civilly liable or criminally liable. And that's just going to escalate the whole issue even more. So that's my expectation about what might happen next.
Graham, thank you, Joel. So I want to ask, we talked about, kind of what would happen if the United States in a future presidency gets rid of this EO, and how, the ship has sailed, so to speak, in that other countries have already taken action as well. The UK, France has banned travel from certain settlers, and it sounds like Spain has stated that they'll impose their own sanctions if, in the course of EU's current discussions, that you decide not to. Do you see additional countries following suit? And what broader impact do we think international collaboration could have? And if there's other tactics that also could be taken in addition to sanctions by the international community?
I
Maybe
mean,
that was too broad for 8 minutes left.
it's broad, but I'll just say, look, I think it's important to understand where leverage exists and where it doesn't. Coupled with the EO, the administration also issued a national security memo trying to ensure that those who receive defense articles from the United States obey international humanitarian law and enable US supported or US direct humanitarian assistance. That was issued on February 8th. And together with the EO, I've claimed that this is the Biden administration creating leverage, but the leverage is for something very particular. I think we can't mix things. The administration, and I'd even argue its regional and international allies, are not looking to use sticks to push the Israelis into a peace process with the Palestinians. They're not. They're not, for example, using this to force a normalization deal with the Saudis and for Israel to recognize a Palestinian state. That is not what these tools are being utilized for, and it would be a mistake if people thought that they were. The EO is being used to moderate and to prevent settler violence. That is what it is meant to. The National Security Memo is meant to moderate and try and change, or at least limit Israeli behavior in Gaza to align with standing US law. So when Minister Smotrich bans flour coming in from Ashdod, that the Prime Minister promised to the Secretary of State and the President that there will be a significant consequence if that isn't resolved by March 25th, when a signed agreement between the parties has to come in. So do I see more international support for sanctioning against violence in the West Bank, violent settlers? Should there not be an adequate response by the State of Israel to prevent this phenomena? Yes, I do. And I think that should the Trump administration come back into power in 24 and remove the executive order, I could imagine the Europeans moving further, as well as regional governments moving further on such such sanctions-based regimes. And I could also assume that you might even see moves at the UN specifically to try and create an international sanctions regime on specifically settler violence, which would mean that should the US even veto that during a Trump second term, when a Democrat comes back in, the Overton frame has moved to such an extent that one would assume that this would be a snapback for any Democratic administration. I can't overemphasize the watershed moment that it was President Biden who created this executive order. Arguably the most Zionist president we've probably ever had in America. Like in terms of and especially how he's even perceived in Israel as the man who said don't, the man who moved the aircraft carriers, the man who ensured that Israel's time of need, he didn't need to be asked, but stood on Israel's side. And he's the one who created a sanctions regime. The weight of that is significant.
I'll just say one thing. President Biden is still perceived in this way. And this, in Israel, I think this was not perceived as something against Israel. This is such an ugly phenomenon that I think it is understood that this is against very radical settlers. What is not understood in Israel is how this, the settlement, the settler violence is, it implements or it's a larger policy eventually, and the connections between settler groups. This is not understood, but I don't think this is perceived as President Biden going against Israel, rather going against very radical and extreme settlers. And I think this is definitely not put President Biden's popularity in Israel, as he's definitely, as Joel said correctly, is being perceived. It's very popular, it's very liked, and is credited for helping Israel in this very difficult time.
Thank you. Okay, I have a few short questions that I just want to get through. Sorry, we're running out of time. One, I have a question in the chat. Does the US do this type of sanction against Hamas, and is it working? There are a number of anti-terror financing laws on the books and mechanisms already well established in the United States. However, after the 7th, there were 4 rounds of sanctions, I believe, against individual Hamas members, in addition to the many, many layers that we have to ensure that US dollars or American dollars are not funneled indirectly to Hamas. But feel free to add if anyone wants to add to that.
I'll just say yes, there's dozens of sanctions and individuals, and that's why Hamas can't just open a bank account in the West and start accepting donations.
Yeah, okay. Speaking of donations, I had a question from someone who wants to know if their donations could expose them to risk. Either donating to Roots, Shorshim, Judor, but I think we could expand this out to other just like general DAF and other Jewish funds like that.
As long as if you're donating to peace groups between settlers and Palestinians like Shorshim, I think you're fine, because these individuals would definitely not be participating. If you are nervous, just check to make sure that the groups that you're donating to are doing beneficiary screening, and just to make sure that they're aware. But I mean, if you're on this webinar, unless you're not really aligned with Americans for Peace Now, the people that you're donating to in the West Bank, I don't think are the targets. Though it should always be know who you're benefiting type thing. And as a donor, you should always have due diligence to make sure that what you're donating for, if you're donating for a peace group in the West Bank and somehow it landed in the sanctions individuals, you're probably fine. It's the group who distributed the money to the sanctions individuals that isn't. But if you did know, or if you were creating a conspiracy that looked like a peace group, but it was going elsewhere, that's when you're in trouble.
Thank you. Speaking of conspiracies / being shady with money, there's a question about whether or not money can be raised through a GoFundMe using a fictitious name and then delivered to sanctioned persons.
That would be a criminal offense, of which I think it's, I'm not a lawyer, this shouldn't be seen as legal advice, XYZ, but it's significant criminal time in jail, plus significant, like tens of millions of dollars of fines. So if you are, and it says it exactly in the executive order, if you are committing a conspiracy to overcome US sanctions, that is a significant federal crime, extremely serious. So if you are caught, good luck to you.
Awesome. Okay, one more question, then I promise we'll wrap up. I'm sorry, you guys. Thank you for sticking with me here. Do we know if the United States warned the Israeli government that these sanctions were coming?
I don't know. I think the response of the Israeli government would indicate to me possibly not. I will say this is one of the big advantages of having Ambassador Jack Lew on the ground as a former Treasury Secretary and someone extremely familiar with how the sanctions regime works. I'm sure he can educate and inform his various interlocutors about how serious this is. And what this can mean, as well as to the heads of the Israeli banking system and the central bank in Israel. So we're blessed to have an ambassador who's so familiar and fluent in OFAC, having been a former Treasury Secretary himself.
I'll just say that I don't know as well. I can only predict as Joel did, but I will say that the issue of settler violence, and Joel also referred to this before, has been raised between the U.S. administration and Israel so many times before. This is not something new that came out of the blue in that sense. And I think, the way Israel responded led us to this point, unfortunately.
So true. Okay, we are at time. if you don't mind, I'd love to ask just one final short question. And that is, could sanctions ultimately be imposed on Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Technically, sure. Practically, no. I don't think we've sanctioned Vladimir Putin. If we haven't sanctioned Vladimir Putin, then we're not going to be sanctioning the Prime Minister of Israel. Again, like the aim of this is corrective behavior, not punishment. Sanctioning the head of, the head of a government is not where you're going with this. That's not the purpose of this tool. Could I imagine, though, should, for example, Minister Ben-Gvir order his forces not to impose regulation, law, and order in the West Bank, and they can tie him to it? Could I imagine a world in which Minister Ben-Gvir is sanctioned? Yes, and that's a huge, you don't have to go. That's already a gigantic step. And the fact that it was reported that it was considered and then taken away is a very big deal.
And I'll just say really briefly, I doubt it as well. I do think eventually it's politics. I don't think we're very far from there. But between four individuals that none of us, or most of us, were not aware of their names prior to the sanctions, and until Prime Minister Netanyahu, there's so much in between. And I think the most significant ones are settler groups, and there are so many settler groups and some of them are very significant with a lot of money and a lot of funding. That are building illegal construction and taking over of lands, and most notably Amana. So if you've heard Amana, I think that should be like my call to the U.S. administration is to look at these groups that are making the most impact on the ground and are changing or risking our stability. And first and foremost, it's that group and others, but that specifically.
Well, thank you both so much for this great conversation. I know we could be going much longer, so I appreciate everyone sticking with us. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to your question, but I am so grateful for you all taking the time, and I guess we'll close here.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Madeleine. Bye,
Thank you. Bye.